fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
I'm your host, Al Warren. Co-host is Kev Thompson.
Hey, everybody.
So today we are going to talk about the Kennedy assassination tapes, and probably a few other things as well. We've got just a great journalist and author here. We've got Max Holland. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be with you.
So now, Max, the Kennedy assassination tapes. So you actually have the tapes. Now that's of Lyndon Johnson and the aftermath of the assassination. How did you obtain them?
Well, after Oliver Stone's movie, the Congress passed a legislation mandating the gathering and release of all assassination-related documents, and one of the documents were the tapes that Lyndon Johnson made while he was president. And although these were technically exempt from the legislation because they were under a deed of gift of Johnson to his own library and closed for 75 years, the library director, a fellow named Harry Middleton, thought it would be a good idea to open them. So, with the permission of Lady Bird Johnson, they exhumed these tapes, which had never been heard. And first they started out with all the assassination-related tapes. So these are tapes made the days immediately after the assassination, leading up to the Warren Commission's creation. And then there are a lot of assassination-related conversations in December, but gradually it becomes less and less a topic. You know, there's a smattering of conversations in January and March and April. And then later, in 1967 and 66, the assassination rears its head again with Jim Garrison and other critics of the Warren Report. Eventually, Harry Middleton persuaded Lady Bird to release all the Johnson tapes, you know, on any subject, and those are heard over C-SPAN, and, you know, a lot of people find them entertaining and informative. But in 2004, I put out a book just looking at these assassination-related tapes and trying to put them in context. Because one of the things about these tapes, you know, they're so oriented to events of the day that unless you have enough context, you can literally misunderstand them.
Right. Now, when you get to these tapes, as I understand it, Lyndon Johnson talks a lot about the assassination, but he doesn't talk as if he was behind it or he knew what went on. Wouldn't that in itself kind of eliminate books like Roger Stone's book accusing Johnson of being the assassin?
Yeah, but I'm sure he's a ready answer for that, you know, that the tapes were made on purpose to, you know, confuse and the historical issue or culpability of Johnson. So the answer to the question is yes, but, you know, Roger Stone, like our president, will say anything. So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I kind of... go ahead.
Oh, no. So are you suggesting that these tapes are kind of an obfuscation?
No, I'm saying they're not. I'm saying Roger Stone will say they are.
Yeah. Yeah, because Roger Stone... basically in his book accused Johnson of being behind the whole assassination.
Right.
So, yeah, it's hard. But
if you listen to them, you know, He's desperate for information. He's concerned about whether he's a target too. He doesn't know if this is an attempt to decapitate the U.S. government, whether by Cuba or the Soviet Union. To any reasonable person, it's clear that they exculpate Johnson.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what's your assessment on the Warren Commission, the Warren Report?
Oh, it's a long answer.
Yeah.
Well, just a general overview, as in because what I say is there's two camps. One is obviously saying it's whitewashed, it's fake, it's not, it wasn't done correctly, and they're suspect of everybody that was on the actual commission, and others are the other side saying, well,
right.
Well,
I'm kind of in the middle. I mean, I started out sort of agnostic. I didn't know what to make of the commission. I was concerned. This is before I researched it. I was concerned they didn't know this, they didn't do that. The FBI withheld information from them. Robert Kennedy withheld information from them. The CIA withheld information from them. How good a job could they have done if they were denied all this information? And then as I got into the case, I'd say I became known and admitted staunch defender of the integrity of the commission. I've interviewed almost all the staff members. I interviewed Gerald Ford before he died. He was the last remaining commissioner. So I'm a staunch defender of its basic integrity, but it is also true that the commission made mistakes that put its own work in disrepute.
Yeah.
I'll admit to that. And the biggest one, to my way of thinking, is that they accepted the widespread perception that the Zapruder film was a recording of the entire assassination. And because they did that, they made some big mistakes that injured their reputation.
Yeah. One key part to that is the Allen Dulles. It seems to have him being on the commission, they were saying was a person that Kennedy was firing, and they didn't get along and shouldn't have been on the council or the commission itself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you listen to the conversation between Johnson and Dulles, at that time it was known that Oswald had gone to Mexico and had gone to the Cuban and Soviet embassies. It was considered an intelligence issue of the highest order that suggested that perhaps, since it had happened just weeks before the assassination, that there was some connection between the communists and the assassination. So Johnson wanted, one of America's most esteemed intelligence experts on the commission. Dulles doesn't want to go on it because he's afraid of the propaganda windfall that'll come from the Soviet Union if he's on the commission, because he knows that they're going to accuse him of being part of an intelligence whitewash. So he says, "Are you sure you want me to do this, Mr. President? Have you thought through all the implications?" And Johnson says, isn't going to take no for an answer, and he puts Dulles on. So,
yeah.
But that's, nobody can blame him. I mean, that's a rather admirable attitude to take, especially given today's society.
Attitude on whose part, Dulles's, or?
Yes, are you sure you want me to do this? He's thinking ahead.
Right. He is, because he knows that it's made-for-order propaganda that the head of the CIA is on this, that just is going to give Soviet propaganda a real line or a theme to mine, which is that Dulles is engaged in an intelligence cover-up. And of course, some people do believe that he did, but the only thing he helped cover up, from my point of view, was that we had been trying to kill Castro. I mean, that's what he helped cover up. But then Robert Kennedy was covering that up too.
Yeah, but eventually that was going to become a big issue.
Well, nobody knew that at the time.
Nobody
knew that at the time.
Given the Bay of Pigs and everything else that was going to eventually, hit the news.
Well, eventually is, pretty vague, eventually when? 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? I mean, as far as Dulles was concerned, it might be a secret for 50 years. Certainly they didn't foresee what was going to happen. I mean, it really came out because of Watergate. I mean, that's led to the church hearings and the Senate and the House hearings, and that's when it was really confirmed. Now, there were newspaper reports of it before that's to be sure, but, it's different having a newspaper story or a columnist alleging it and having the U.S. government and CIA witnesses testify to it. So they were operating on the fact that it needed to be kept secret, and they certainly weren't going to step forward and be the first to break that secret.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you actually talk about the Deep Throat, and you have an article about the myth of Deep Throat,
right?
About Mark Felt.
Right, that's another book I wrote, a separate book,
yeah.
But related because doing the book on the Kennedy assassination, I learned a lot about how the FBI operated, especially under Hoover, and his mania for never being proven wrong about anything, and blaming everyone else except the FBI for any missteps. So
ego.
Yes, enormous. I mean, it's hard to explain to people who've come of age since then, because you usually don't have an agency of the U.S. government dominated by a personality cult. But that's the case that was true at the FBI, and that led directly to the machinations of Mark Felt.
Now, I've been wanting to ask this for years. What was his motivating factor to do what he did?
Well, he wanted to be the FBI director. As far as he was concerned, it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. That job, Hoover had held the job for 49 years. It didn't look like there was going to be another opportunity, so it was all or nothing. So, and he had maneuvered himself into being the heir apparent, but unbeknownst to him, or he didn't sufficiently weigh the fact that Nixon had got persuaded that the FBI needed a breath of fresh air, an outsider. So he wasn't going to appoint the designated heir apparent when Hoover suddenly died of a heart attack. Instead, he appointed someone, an assistant attorney general named Pat Gray, and this was going to be the first time that the FBI director was going to have to be confirmed by the Senate. And Nixon didn't want a big confirmation fight in '72 because it was an election year, and he didn't want all the business of Hoover's misdeeds, dragged up in an election year. So he made Pat Gray an interim appointee, and he told Gray, if you do a creditable job, when the time comes after the election, I might appoint you to the permanent directorship. And he didn't know really what he was doing by that, because Felt realized or decided that if he leaked adverse information about Gray's performance to the press, that he might be able to turn Nixon against Gray. And then the break-in happened, and Felt instantly realized that it was very politically sensitive. Any details about it, about the FBI's investigation that appeared in the press, would instantly, antagonize Nixon and the whole White House. So that's what he did with Bob Woodward. And also another reporter who doesn't get enough credit, a Time magazine reporter named Sandy Smith. So that was what Felt was about. Watergate was not a campaign issue. It was not threatening Nixon's election. Most people, hard to believe, didn't care about it one whit, except, some Democrats. Nixon was headed for a landslide victory. So Felt could leak details and turn Nixon against Gray. And that's what he was all about. Little did he know that it was going to turn out to what it turned out to be. But that was basically his motive, was to impugn his boss. And all the while he was telling Pat Gray, boy, you're a breath of fresh air. You're the best thing that happened to Bureau in, 20 years. He was a slimy, lying son of a bitch.
Well, you just ruined it for me, because here I'm sitting here listening to you, and I'm like, well, man, it almost sounds like this guy cared more about integrity than he did his own ego, given what you just said that he was trying to do. But, what we know about Deep Throat and Mark Felt is, he was meeting in secret in parking garages, and he was giving information, sensitive information, and it's almost like he was trying to do the right thing.
Well, a lot of that is hype. One thing I realized when I did that book is that All the President's Men really has to be seen as, part of the new journalism. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, but in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a sudden enthusiasm for something that was called the new journalism, in which the journalist made himself part of the story and introduced novelistic elements into the story, and wrote about it from a personal vantage point. And All the President's Men is written in the first person, in the third person. They're writing about the event as if they're, they call themselves Woodward and Bernstein, but of course, they're participants. So it's really over-dramatized. People who worked at the Post at the same time, considered it a false picture in many, many ways of what happened. It was, a simple, beautiful morality tale. And Deep Throat, no one anticipated he would assume the significance that he did. I mean, Felt was asked if he wanted to be identified, and he said, "Are you kidding?" And reamed Woodward out and said, no. And in fact, one of the ironies of the whole Deep Throat thing is that Woodward and Bernstein get credit, for being these intrepid reporters. You'd have to pull their fingernails out before they would reveal their sources. Well, they betrayed Felt because, the deal with him was he was not to be mentioned by name for sure. He was not to be identified as a source in any stories. He was not to be quoted, and even his existence wasn't supposed to be acknowledged. And they more or less did that in their newspaper stories, but when it came to time to write the book, they violated, virtually every one of those stipulations, except they didn't use Felt's name or where he worked. Otherwise, they breached, they have these long passages quoting him supposedly verbatim. That was not, so they violated, for the book, the agreement they had 2 years earlier made to him, on swearing on a stack of Bibles. So they were very expedient. Their explanation was, well, we couldn't write the book without, acknowledging his existence. It wouldn't have been the truth. Well, that was not what Felt thought he was in for.
Well, one more point, and then I promise I'm going to shut up and let Al take it for just a moment. From what I'm understanding, though, Mark Felt kind of had, ideas that maybe he could replace, Hoover.
Right.
So why not just come out with the information, come out and do it publicly? Because this is stuff that America needed to know was really going on behind the scenes. it's not all rainbows and unicorns.
Well,
and if anything happens to me, then you'll know who did it.
look, the only president who was going to appoint Mark Felt was Richard Nixon. George McGovern, the Democratic candidate, had already criticized Hoover. In fact, one of the things that had helped make his name was in 70, 71, when it was still very rare for a politician to dare utter the name Hoover in a critical way. He had gone on record criticizing Hoover's FBI. And he wasn't going to appoint an insider if he became president. If anything, he would have cleaned the place out. So Felt was banking on Richard Nixon being reelected. He didn't want to do anything, and he didn't think he was doing anything to harm that. And as far as he was concerned, the illegality of Watergate, he wasn't concerned about that in the slightest. I mean, this is a guy who authorized FBI black bag jobs all the time. He thought that was a proper investigative technique. In fact, he was, later during the Carter administration, he was tried for just exactly that and found guilty. And then Reagan pardoned him. So this isn't someone who was concerned about the illegality of the break-in or anything of that sort. He was just using it to destroy his perceived rivals, and one of them, the most nearest one, was Pat Gray. And Gray had no idea what was going on. I mean, he was naive in a way.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Al.
Well, if you had... I was going to say, what exactly do you think the biggest misperception the public has about Watergate is?
Well, it's probably the role of journalism. I mean, I think, and of the Post in particular. I mean, the press did play an important role, but if you really look at those first 6 months, I'm talking about from June to January 73, when the original burglars were tried, it was the legal process that was really the hero, and that's why one is so concerned about what's happening today, because there was great concern about the integrity of the Justice Department at that time, and there was a lot of reason to be. Kleindienst knew that something untoward happened, and he didn't tell the prosecutors lower down from him, but he also didn't interfere with them. He just didn't tell them the truth. He's, lying by omission. Kleindienst being the Attorney General. So there was a great deal to be concerned about, but in the end, the legal system, worked slowly, but, it forced McCord to confess that perjury had occurred at the trial. Eventually, it brought John Dean into the prosecutor's office, and he confessed all, even before he went before the Senate Watergate Committee. So that's why it was really the integrity of the justice system, despite some creakiness in it, that ultimately triumphed. And that was more important than, stories in the press. Now, that helped the stories in the Washington Post and other newspapers, the LA Times in particular, helped inoculate the prosecutors from, people interfering with what they were doing. But, there's an old saying, the wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind extremely fine, and that is, I guess, what I'd say is the biggest misconception, that, if you look at what Woodward and Bernstein were reporting, in every case they're only reporting what the FBI already knew. So it's not like they were, breaking a story and the government comes in and says, oh, look at this corruption. I mean, all the information they had that they got from Felt and other sources were things that the prosecutors and the already knew. So it made them look like they broke the story because they were reporting in public what the prosecutors knew in private. It's just like with Mueller now. Right. I mean, do you think that the press knows as much as he does? I don't think so. Or at least I hope not.
No,
I hope
not even
not.
close.
I don't know.
But
He's been very. I think, they say he's been practically leak-proof, which is unheard of in Washington.
yeah. Well, and that's sort of, in a way, that's the way it should be done anyway.
It should be. It should be done. I mean, what Felt did, because of his motive, was entirely inappropriate.
Yeah. But back then, but people had a better trust in the press than they do now.
Right.
So I don't know how we're going to get back to that. Because how do you unring that bell? And then with the major groups out there like Alex Jones and Roger Stone and doing all their stick.
Right.
How do people particularly know where to go? And even then, you can't really tell them. They have to actually want to believe in someone.
Right. It's very difficult. I mean, I sympathize, and I live there in Washington. I know reporters. I have read those papers for years now, and it's very difficult. You have to look at the byline and know the reputation of the reporter.
Yeah. You have to kind of follow up. Yeah.
You have to be an educated consumer. I mean, there's a lot of reporters, who I'm frankly surprised write for the New York Times because, I know their biases and, frankly surprised that they write for them. And the same can be true at the Post. Being at those two newspapers isn't a guarantee of objectivity and integrity.
Yeah.
Well, let's be intellectually honest here, though. I mean, everybody, and I'm not trying to be dirty here, but everybody wants to be deep-throated. Everybody wants to have the information, and I want to give it out. I want to be that person.
Well, deep throat. There are some people who leak for that, personal advancement. There are other people who leak for principle. There are other people who leak because, they're sleeping with the reporter. That's just happened. There are other people who leak to just show how important they are. I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons. And it's important as a reporter to realize why you're being given the information. And I'm not saying that, the reason has to be pure and white as snow to use information, but you don't want to be used, and you're susceptible to being used if you don't understand why you've been favored with this information.
Right.
And some people just work very hard and they cultivate sources, and then when a story comes, their weeks and months spent cultivating a source pay off. So, but there's a lot of seaminess in the reporter-source relationship.
Yeah.
But as personalities who do a radio show, Al and I and Julie, we work in the paranormal circles as well. We do a paranormal segment. And for example, we always have experts that come on. Well, I'm air quoting experts that, I've got information on Area 51.
Mm-hmm.
I've got this information and that information, and I want to put this information out there so the public knows. And, it is very reminiscent of what Deep Throat did in that parking garage. How do we sort out what's truth and what's BS?
Well, it's, hard, and it's gotten a lot harder. It used to be that, when the media was much more, I don't want to use the word controlled, but it was, much harder to get out there when the major networks dominated and the major newspapers dominated. Everything was mediated, and you sort of had to pass hurdles to get your information out there. Now it's like the wild, wild west, and anybody can put up a website, and anybody can say anything they want, and a lot of credulous people out there, and they repeat it, and then you don't know where it originally came from, etc., etc., etc. So it's a devilish problem, and I don't have an easy answer to it.
Yeah. Well, another thing I was thinking and saw you write about was Oswald's first shot missed.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that? Like, what's your point on that?
Well, that point is related to the Zapruder film. What happened is after Oswald was murdered, 2 days after the assassination, the overwhelming vantage point for the assassination shifted from his sniper's perch on the 6th floor of the Texas School Depository to the Zapruder film. And when that shift took place, because the Zapruder film was only record of the shooting, and it didn't have to be made, in which case we would have just had to stick with restaging the assassination from Oswald's point of view. But instead, the presumption was made that Zapruder had recorded the assassination in full. Well, if you look at the Zapruder film, it's 26 seconds in duration.
Wow.
The first 7 seconds are just of these lead motorcycles driving by. And Zapruder stops his camera after about 7 seconds of running it. Because he doesn't, in those days he had a wind-up camera, he didn't know exactly how much film he had left, and he didn't want to record, Dallas motorcycle policemen. So he waited until he saw the president. And as soon as he was sure that he was seeing the president, that's when he started his camera, and that's frame 133, and then it rolls, until the end. Well, if you actually think about it for a while, you realize that the car, the limousine, was already about 70 feet down into Dealey Plaza by that time. And Oswald, who was a trained Marine, trained to fire at the upper body mass, and we've all seen those silhouettes, a head and an upper body torso. That's what he's trained to fire at. And that silhouette came into his line of sight about, I forget the exact figure, it's 1.7 seconds, I think, or maybe even 2, before Zapruder restarted his camera. And I could go, digress and go into a long explanation of how I came to realize this, but the point is, I suddenly realized that Oswald had his target in sight before Zapruder started his camera, and I realized that there was a possibility of a fundamental misunderstanding in which Zapruder's perspective was equated with Oswald's, when in fact they're two different perspectives. And through that I came to the realization that in all likelihood, and the best explanation of what happened, is that Oswald fired before Zapruder restarted his camera. And so you're never going to find the first shot, which people were looking at in the Zapruder film, because it already happened. And actually, the Zapruder film only makes sense when you realize it's the second and third shots. And this whole business of did Oswald have enough time, how difficult was it, et cetera, is all put to rest when you realize. And in fact, if you look at Zapruder's own testimony before the Warren Commission, he says, I heard 2 shots. Mm-hmm. They say there were 3, and I'm not going to say there aren't 3, but I heard and saw 2 shots. And in fact, that's what he filmed. And that's all he filmed. So all this, 6 seconds in Dallas, and how could someone operate a rifle that quickly, it all melts away when you realize that the film is a time clock of the assassination, yes, but it's a time clock of one that had already started. And therefore, it's, the film is both extremely informative, but it was also extremely deceptive, because it became, it became the vision of the assassination. You couldn't imagine the assassination without running the film in your head, and in fact the film was only partial.
Let me say this. You're about the fourth, perhaps the fifth person that I have talked about the JFK assassination with, and you're the first person that has brought this out. The Zapruder film, which we have based everything on, if you look at the first frames, JFK is leaning forward.
Mm-hmm. The first frames from when he restarted the camera.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Now, I am going to guess, and tell me if I'm wrong, please, that could be from the first shot, because you brought this up. We, as military men, are taught to shoot center mass, and center mass is generally a chest shot.
Right.
And that first shot could have hit him in the chest. Everybody talks about the headshots.
Yeah.
But was there a shot in the chest?
There was one that entered his upper back, but that only becomes evident around frame 223, which is, 110 frames after the Zapruder film restarts. I mean, he isn't in distress, obviously, to the naked eye until frame 222 or 223 when he reaches for his throat. And that's the bullet that entered his upper back and exits his throat.
Is it a possibility, though, that was the second shot?
Well, that was the second shot.
Yeah.
Okay.
The first shot to hit. See, there's one of the big problems is nomenclature here. The first shot to hit him is the second shot. The first shot, doesn't hit him, doesn't hit anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's another issue. Why did it miss? But for the moment, let's just put this aside. The second shot is the one that hits him in the upper back, exits his throat, and hits Conley. And then the third shot is the one that hits him in the head.
Yeah,
and those are the two shots that Zapruder says he noticed, and then he filmed.
Yeah, just be patient with me. I'm taking notes. I'm taking notes as we're writing. Seriously, I'm taking notes. So.
Yeah, that's all right. Now, with all of the conspiracy that's arisen from the whole JFK, I sort of put that as the beginning of what we have in today's media and world.
Well, you're very perceptive. I agree. I mean, it's always, and we have these periodic eruptions of interest in the JFK case because it was, it was never truly put to rest. It took me a long time to come to this analytical point of view, but, the Warren Commission had 5 questions to answer, and 2 of them were already answered before they even started work. What happened, the assassination of the president, when did it happen? Everybody knew that. But the other question is who, how, and why. Now, how is going to determine who, right?
Yeah.
I mean, once you determine how exactly he was killed, that's going to point the finger at who. And who is going to tell you why. Well, since one of the who's, at least, was killed, then right away you're left to speculate. I mean, your analysis of Oswald's motives is as good as mine, or as good as anybody else's. He left no note. He didn't explain himself to his brother or his wife. So, it's really a matter of interpreting his past and coming to your own conclusion about that. So that goes to motive. Who, well, did he have any, even if he physically did the killing in Dealey Plaza, did he have any Confederates outside who were assisting him or put him up to it or going to help him get away? So, again, his murder leaves that to, more vague than we possibly might want it. So that leaves how. How was the president murdered in Dealey Plaza? And that was a question, though, that the Warren Commission could have and should have answered in a clear, compelling, concise way. And it's precisely because of this problem with the Zapruder film, believing that all 3 shots fired were on the film in some way, that if you read the pages of the Warren Report, I wouldn't say it's inaccurate, but it's the most convoluted, confusing explanation, because they go through each of the possibilities. The first shot fired was the one that missed. The second shot fired was the one that missed, and the third shot fired was the one that missed. Initially, they thought it made the most sense that the third shot fired was the one that missed, because the car would be furthest away, and of course, you'd be most likely to miss. But almost everybody in Dealey Plaza said the shot to the head was the last shot. So that didn't work. Conversely, if he hit him twice at those distances, how could he miss him when he was closest?
Right.
That didn't seem to make sense either, superficially.
Well,
although it's a more difficult shot than you might think. So they kind of said, it was a second shot that missed. Well, once you do that, you're in this 3 shots in 6 seconds and of a moving target. And it becomes exceedingly difficult to do that. Not impossible, but difficult. And it just opened a can of worms that the Warren Commission never, successfully put an end to. And, once you start questioning the how, well, the who and the why are, as I said, they're problematic to begin with. But if you haven't even answered how, and there's only one way it happened. It doesn't happen a different way every time you see the president drive through Dealey Plaza. It happened one way. Well, which was that one way?
Yeah.
And they didn't come up with that because, basically they ran out of time. They had a lot to do. They came up with one shot hit both men, which was true, which was a departure from what the FBI had found. So they thought they had, done a good job, but in fact it was a soft underbelly.
And plus there's all these wild cards that were thrown in there. The type of rifle, you couldn't reload it within this amount of time. And there, the grassy knoll, and I mean, there was just so much to it.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of issues that get involved. It's a bolt action rifle. It's not an automatic rifle. You pull the trigger and you can squeeze off 3 shots in a blink of an eye. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. But I've worked on it for a long time, and basically it came down to the what I think is the rock bottom truth is that how was the question that they should have answered, and they shouldn't have rested until they had the answer. There was an answer. It was elusive. They didn't get it. You can't say their report is wrong because they if you really read it, it was written by lawyers, and you practically have to be a lawyer to read it, but you can't exactly say the language is wrong, but it's not as clear as it should have been, and, critics, some of whom were not well-intentioned, have exploited that, and, to the Commission's detriment. But you can't blame the critics. It's the Commission's fault.
Yeah. But now that has become the way of analyzing. So now society seems to be suspicious of everything that happens. So every time there's a mass shooting, a school shooting, or any sort of thing that goes on, all of a sudden it's a false flag. It's a government thing.
Right, and the sickest example of that would be, the people who accused that elementary school shooting in Connecticut of being a false flag. Alex Jones. I mean, he's being sued for that right now. I mean, that shows you the disgusting level to which we've sunk. That someone, would feel free to make that allegation, which is, to the parents of the children who died there is just beyond belief.
Well, why can they do that? Like, the big thing is that's something that wouldn't have happened back during the Kennedy shooting or during Watergate. It's not something that would have been accepted. So why is it that it's acceptable now? Why is it that we have these media outlets, so they call themselves, doing that kind of reporting? Because people believe it. People follow it.
Yeah, well, it's tragic, and it's very corrosive. People have lost faith in institutions, and this is what happens when that occurs. Like I say, the Warren Commission wasn't perfect, but it isn't like they did this on purpose. It was a perceptual, hurdle that they didn't realize. That it was there if they had, thought outside the box a little. So it wasn't anything that they did, intentionally to do. As far as they were concerned, if they could have come up with a clear explanation, they would have. They did the best they could, and people, have to understand that, because otherwise we're headed in the. Things are bad now.
Well, I could probably answer that as an average Joe. I have a lot of faith in the JFK investigation. I really do. But over the years, we have just gotten used to the government giving us a line of bull. And over the years, we've simply lost faith in what the government tells us. And if somebody comes along with an explanation that seems to make more sense, we're willing to accept that.
Yeah. Well, the government isn't perfect, and I think I.F. Stone says, governments lie all the time, so it is a problem. But when it's something as fundamental as, who killed the president, and Oliver Stone said, or Jim Garrison, quoted by Oliver Stone, said, if our government isn't telling us the truth about who killed our president, then, they'll lie about anything and, have a coup d'etat. It's just like people say that the deep state is after Trump now. The government is complicated. It has in its bureaucracies institutional instincts which may be at odds with the president, but to believe that the agents in the bowels of the government would go about killing the president, well, that's Hollywood.
Yeah, it gets a bit dramatic, but
and it's nothing new. I here recently I watched a documentary about the killing of Abraham Lincoln on Fox News. Just out of interest. And my goodness, they already had a story in place. Not the government side, but Booth. They already had a story in place that would have made sense.
Well, that was a conspiracy, obviously. The question is whether it was a conspiracy that the Confederacy had put up or whether Booth was acting independently, and I'm not sure we'll ever know.
Yes.
But there's no doubt. They were, killing several officials that night, or tried to, so obviously it was a conspiracy.
Well, Max, this has been very, very interesting. You're a great guest to have on, and we'll have your books on our website as well. Our guest has been Max Holland. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.